He felt it. No one needed to say anything. The silence that surrounded him in morning encounters, the omitted greetings, the half-finished smiles were enough. One by one, those who once called him righteous now looked away. It wasn't anger. It was judgment. The kind of contempt that doesn't shout but leaves a mark. And still, Joseph remained. The workshop now had less movement. Some former customers walked past him even when he waved. Others sent their children to pick up the orders, as if afraid to speak to him. The carpenter, once known for his punctuality and precision, was now just the man who had accepted an impure woman. But Joseph wasn't seeking public reconciliation. He sought inner obedience. The Midrash taught that he who suffers shame and does not respond, who hears insults and does not reply, is like the sun at its peak. Joseph didn't read the Midrash, but he lived it. He understood what it meant to be light without fanfare. At home, Mary remained silent with him, silent. The two now formed a pact of survival amid the disbelief of others. When she went to fetch water, she heard whispers. When she returned, she kept her eyes down, but there was strength in her steps, a firmness that Joseph admired without saying so. One morning, when delivering a bench to the home of an elder from the village, Joseph was met with a closed door. "We no longer need it," said the man from behind the wood. Joseph simply nodded. He didn't argue, didn't try to plead. He picked up the bench on his shoulders and returned down the dusty road with the same dignity he had left with. The eyes of Nazareth were everywhere, even among relatives. The house of Yurkim, Mary's father, no longer received visitors. The women in the family began to avoid saying her name in conversations. Shame was more contagious than leprosy, and Joseph cut, soared, sanded. Sometimes he made pieces for no one, just to keep his hands busy and his mind steady. He built structures with the same calm with which he rebuilt his own dignity. At night, when the village's silence became almost bearable, he would go out to look at the stars. He remembered what the angel had said and asked himself in a low voice, "How can God's will cause so much rejection from men?" There was no answer, only the clear sky and the earth's breath. A few days later, a Pharisee approached him discreetly on the road to the synagogue. Joseph listened with wisdom. There are ways to correct what happened. The Torah allows annulment, perhaps a journey, a new beginning. It was a veiled proposal, an invitation to flee. Joseph took a deep breath. The question wasn't new. He'd been hearing it inside himself for weeks, but the answer was also old. "What is happening is not a mistake," he replied, "and it doesn't need to be corrected." The Pharisee didn't insist. He simply shook his head in silence and went on his way, convinced he was speaking to a fool. But Joseph knew foolishness in the eyes of men was often faithfulness in the eyes of God. That same night, upon returning from the synagogue, he found Mary sitting by the lamplight, her hands on her now visibly swollen belly. She wasn't crying, but there was something in her eyes, a mix of weariness and conviction that brought a lump to his throat. He approached, sat beside her, and for a while neither said a word. She spoke first. "You didn't have to stay." Joseph looked at her, then at her belly. "I have never been closer to God's purpose than I am now." Mary smiled, not lightly, but reverently. And in that exchange of glances, something was sealed. They were not there by accident, they were not there to be understood, they were there to obey. The eyes of Nazareth would continue to judge them, but the eyes of heaven were already upon them. Luke 2:15. The announcement came with Rome's seal and the weight of iron. An imperial decree clear and non-negotiable. Everyone must register in their city of origin. Age, condition, or health didn't matter. It was law, and before Caesar, even the womb of a woman about to give birth was not exempt. Joseph heard the decree read aloud in the synagogue in silence. The scribe barely concealed his discomfort. No one wanted that journey, but everyone knew disobeying Rome was like provoking a lion with bare hands. Bethlehem. That's where he had to go. The city of his fathers. The city of David. The same city from which the prophet said would come the one who would shepherd Israel. Joseph didn't know what hurt more, the long journey or the risk to Mary. She didn't protest. She simply listened, then looked at him with eyes that didn't ask why. "But when do we leave?" There was in that silent exchange a new pact now, not with Nazareth but with the road. The next morning he prepared everything he could. A donkey, a waterskin, a sack with dates and dry bread. No luxury, no heavy saddlebags, only the essentials and faith. The road was long, crossing hills and valleys, more than 120 kilometers to Bethlehem on an uneven route at times among olive trees, at others between cliffs. Mary climbed onto the animal with effort. Her belly now dominated her body. Joseph arranged blankets beneath her, trying to ease the impact of the road. He couldn't remove the stones, but he could make the journey bearable. The first day was the hardest. The silence between them was not empty, but reverent. The stones on the path seemed to have eyes. Each village they passed brought curious, sometimes hostile stares. The couple traveling without haste. He attentive, she protecting her belly with her hands, raised questions no one dared to ask aloud. At night, they slept under a twisted fig tree with the donkey tied to a branch and their bodies covered with thin cloaks. Joseph didn't sleep. The wind was cold and the forest sounds kept him alert. More than that, the responsibility he felt was unbearable. He was not just carrying a woman. He was carrying the promise of God in gestation. On the second day, the heat intensified. The trails became dusty and dry, and Joseph's feet burned inside his leather sandals. He avoided looking back, but he could hear Mary's labored breathing. They stopped frequently. He wet a cloth and placed it on her neck. They shared water in measured sips. When they found shade, they rested. When there was silence, they prayed, not with words, but with glances toward the sky. On one of the steepest stretches, Mary slipped while dismounting the donkey. Joseph caught her by reflex with strength and fear mingled. The fall didn't happen, but the scare remained. She gave a faint smile. He didn't reply. He just embraced her as if trying to hold the entire world in his arms. On the third day, the hills of Judea were already visible in the distance. Bethlehem emerged as both promise and exhaustion. Joseph's legs trembled. His eyes burned, but he didn't complain. With each step, he felt the weight of the calling. The God who had spoken to him in a dream was now walking there silently, wrapped in flesh inside Mary's womb. It was more than a journey. It was a reverse exodus, not to flee Egypt, but to reach the promise. When they saw the first houses of Bethlehem, the sky was already tinged with purple. The sun was setting behind the hills, and the bells of the flocks rang in the distance. Joseph looked at Mary and saw that she was crying silently. It wasn't pain. It was relief, and it was only the beginning. The city of David was full. Bethlehem, once small and discreet, pulsed with the chaos of Roman registrations. Dozens of families, strangers, and caravans filled the courtyards, competing for space in inns, on porches, even in makeshift stables. The streets buzzed with hurried footsteps and loud voices. But none of those voices were there out of faith. They were there out of obligation. Joseph guided Mary carefully. The donkey moved slowly, jostling her already tense belly. Sweat ran down his temples. His gaze, once vigilant, was now urgent. Time was running out, and Mary could no longer hide the contractions. The first door was declined with kindness. The second with coldness. The third didn't even open. Everything is full. Come back tomorrow. Joseph didn't respond. He just nodded, stepped back, tried the next one. With each rejection, the burden grew. Not the luggage, but the weight of helplessness. The man called to protect the Son of God now couldn't even find a place of shelter. Night was approaching, and with it the cold. Mary panted. Her hands clutched her belly tightly. Her eyes, once steady, now trembled between pain and hope. Joseph, she murmured. It's close. He knew. And still he had found nothing. He climbed one more street, turned one more alley, all in vain. No one wanted to make room. Not for them. Not for that woman too pregnant and that man too silent. There was no honor in what they saw, only discomfort. Finally, an elderly woman pointed them to a rudimentary shelter south of the city. It wasn't a house, it wasn't an inn. It was a cave. The shepherds use it to protect animals, she said, not waiting for thanks. Joseph thanked her anyway. He led Mary carefully, climbing the final slope under the bluish moonlight. When they arrived, Silence surrounded them. It was a stone hollow, smelling of old straw with damp walls and air saturated with animal scent. But it was shelter, and that at that hour was everything. Mary didn't complain, she just nodded. Joseph hurried to clean the space. He gathered clean straw, cleared away dried feces, pushed the donkey to the corner. He fetched cloths, water, spread a cloak over a wide stone. He prepared everything as he knew, or rather as he could. The first scream came while he was still preparing. Joseph turned in shock. Mary was already lying down, her face contorted, her fingers gripping the edge of the stone. She looked at him and didn't ask for help. She asked for presence. He approached, knelt beside her, took her hand. And there, under a roof of stone and sky, in the womb of the earth, the birth happened. There was no midwife. There were no instruments. There was only a man with calloused hands and a woman in holy pain. Life burst forth with blood and cries, hers first, then his. The baby's cry filled the cave like a trumpet from the invisible. Joseph felt the air split in half. He had never heard a sound like that, not of strength, but of rupture. There he was, the Son, the promised one, the Word made flesh, now wrapped in blood, skin, and fragility, so small, so human. Joseph took him carefully. His hands, used to rough wood, now trembled before the newborn. He washed him with warm water, dried him with his own clothes, and laid him on the straw. Mary smiled, exhausted. Her eyes overflowed. "He is born," she said in a low voice. Joseph didn't respond. He simply fell to his knees. At that moment, everything stopped. The world went on unaware. Rome slept. The priests slept. The Pharisees slept. But there, in a forgotten cave in Judea, eternity breathed for the first time. The just man who did not speak now wept, not tears of despair, but of awe, because he knew the promise had been fulfilled, and he had seen it born. Luke 28:20. The cave still smelled of dried blood and damp wood. The newborn slept on the straw wrapped in humble cloths. Mary rested nearby, exhausted but serene, her hand resting on her empty belly. The donkey chewed straw in the corner, and the night wind entered gently, as if respecting that space. Joseph remained standing. He looked at the child with a reverence that blended fear, wonder, and a tenderness he did not yet know how to name. His knees ached, his mind still couldn't grasp it, but his spirit knew that moment was not just birth, it was revelation. And then came the footsteps. First the soft sound of staffs dragging dust, then restrained voices, whispers of those who fear their dreaming. Joseph turned. At the entrance of the cave, silhouetted by the pale moonlight, appeared a group of men. Shepherds, simple, poorly dressed, calloused hands like his own. But there was something in their eyes, an urgency that came from beyond the earth. Joseph instinctively placed himself between them and the child, not out of fear, but out of protective instinct. A brief, tense silence filled the air. Then one of them spoke, his voice choked. An angel appeared to us in the field. There was light day, and he said the Savior had been born today here in Bethlehem, and that we would find him wrapped in cloths, lying in a manger. Joseph didn't answer. He simply turned slowly, extended his arm as if to say, "He's there." The men approached with tears in their eyes. They fell to their knees, touched their foreheads to the stone floor, whispered praises with broken voices. Joseph watched. He didn't know them and they didn't know him, but they all knew. They were before something none of their fathers or grandfathers or rabbis had ever seen. Suddenly, they were no longer shepherds. They were momentary prophets, priests of the invisible, men who had spent their lives among sheep and thorns. Now before the Lamb, one of them sang without melody, without rhythm, just ancient words. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace to men of good will. The echo of that phrase pierced Joseph's bones. Men of good will. That was what he was. Nothing more. No title, no glory, just goodwill and obedience. The shepherds stayed until dawn. Then they left as they had come discreetly. But now, with eyes set ablaze on the road back, they would tell everyone, not with eloquence but with the force of those who have seen, and those who see are transformed. They had barely left when new footsteps approached. Joseph heard the heavier steps, men with long robes, camels, dark and penetrating eyes. They were not Jews. They were not from the covenant people. And yet they were there. They were kings, or something like it. Magi, some said, scholars of the stars, guided by a light that broke through the heavens. They came from afar, from the east. They carried precious objects, but their eyes said nothing was more valuable than what they saw there, a child among straw. They bowed and offered gold, frankincense, myrrh, symbols of royalty, worship and death. Joseph saw it all but didn't intervene, didn't interrupt, didn't comment. He simply kept it in his heart. If he had once doubted, now he understood. The heavens didn't just announce, they came and they brought with them the extremes of the world. Shepherds and kings, the field and the palace, the staff and the scepter. Everything converged on that place without doors, because there, lying on straw, was the center of everything. Mary watched with tearful eyes. Joseph remained beside her, his face illuminated by the faint beam of morning light seeping in. No one asked who he was. None of the visitors hailed him as the protagonist, and that was fair, because his mission was not to be seen. It was to uphold what no one could see. When the last ones left, Joseph closed the entrance with a piece of cloth. He sat by the manger, and there, for the first time since it all began, allowed himself to rest. But even with heavy eyes, his soul remained awake, because while everyone saw the child, he also saw the road, the dangers, the burden of raising him, the responsibility that did not end with the birth. It only began there. Joseph was the invisible guardian of the promise, and heaven knew it. Matthew 21:13-15. The night was heavy. The wind that had once passed gently through the cave now brought omens. Joseph did not sleep. His eyes, though exhausted, remained alert to the silence. Mary's breathing was calm. The child, curled up in worn cloths, slept with the serenity of one who does not yet know the world hates him. Then the dream came, but not like the others. The voice was the same, clear, firm, cutting. Get up, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you. For Herod will seek the child to kill him. Joseph woke up sweating, his heart racing, his body tense. He sat up with wide eyes, the name Herod burned in his ears. The king who had killed sons, wives, brothers, the one who tolerated no threats, not even rumors. If there was one name the righteous feared, it was his, and now he was coming for a newborn. Joseph did not hesitate. He rose in silence, knelt beside the child, and took him gently in his arms. He pressed Jesus' head to his chest. Then he woke Mary with a whisper and a look that said, "Everything. It's time. We need to go." She didn't ask why. She knew the tone of urgency in Joseph. She stood, adjusted the cloths around her body, wrapped the baby in blankets, and tied them tightly. Within minutes they were ready. The donkey was pulled with gentle force. The tools, the few provisions, the extra cloths. Everything was gathered into tight sacks. There was no time for farewells, nor explanations, only footsteps. The streets of Bethlehem were empty, the houses slept, but the sky seemed to watch. The moon still high lit the stones of the path. Joseph guided swiftly and carefully. At every distant noise he quickened his pace. His body trembled not from cold but from anticipation. The sword was coming and he knew it. The road south was rough. Narrow paths between hills, unknown valleys, trails used by merchants, soldiers, and now fugitives. Egypt was over 400 kilometers away. But Joseph didn't think of distance. He thought of safety. With each turn taken, he felt time slipping through his fingers like sand. Mary wrapped the child with her own body, whispered ancient prayers in Aramaic, asking that the eyes of God not blink. Joseph looked ahead but heard the echoes of the dream behind him. Herod would send soldiers. They would come with blades, with shouts, with orders, and they would not look for explanations. They would look for the child, the newborn, the one who could not speak, who had barely learned to open his eyes. As he walked, Joseph felt anger rise, not only against Herod, but against the world, a world that did not accept innocence, a world where the Savior had to flee like a thief. But he controlled it, because his role was not to avenge, it was to protect. On the second day of the escape, their provisions were already running out. Joseph divided the bread into tiny pieces. The water was drunk in silence like a rare blessing. The donkey staggered. Mary trembled, and the child cried only from hunger. Yet still they pressed on. At night they slept in the open. Joseph kept his eyes open while the two slept. He listened to every sound, the rustle of trees, the distant lowing of flocks, the silence before a howl. At every snap he gripped the staff tightly, prepared to defend with his life what heaven had entrusted to him. They passed through discreet villages, avoided main routes, crossed shepherds' paths in areas used by exiles. Egypt was not holy ground, but it was refuge. And at that moment, that was what mattered. Days later, the first outlines of the foreign land appeared. Palm trees, scorching sand, distant temples, soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms. The language was strange, the looks suspicious, but there was silence, and no one knew them there. It was in a village of Egyptian Jews that Joseph found shelter. A small room, mud walls, low ceiling. It wasn't home, but it was life. When he laid the child on a bundle of straw, Joseph didn't cry, but he felt the weight of what had been done. He had saved the promised one, but at what cost? Days later, the news arrived. In Bethlehem, mothers wept. The ground had been stained. Herod's order had been fulfilled. The cry of the innocent echoed through the hills. And Joseph remained silent because he had heard the call. He had answered, and the child slept. Egypt was not like Galilee. There were no olive trees, no green hills, no familiar sound of Aramaic songs at dusk. There was sand, tall temples, statues of strange gods, and a language that sounded like stone falling into still water. Joseph walked the streets with eyes downcast, steps restrained, senses alert. The child was in Mary's arms, wrapped in faded cloth, half-open eyes, still an innocent face. There, no one recognized him. No whispers, no scandal, no judgment. Exile, though harsh, offered a truce. They settled on the outskirts of Heliopolis in a modest village where Jews had lived dispersed since ancient days. It was a community forgotten by the empire's powerful yet faithful to the Torah, simple people but welcoming people who knew what it meant to live far from Jerusalem and still keep hope alive. Flavius Josephus would write centuries later that the Jews of Egypt preserved their customs as one guards a flame against the wind. And it was there among them that Joseph found shelter, a clay room, a crooked wooden door, a narrow window, an improvised home. But enough. Joseph returned to carpentry. The city needed boxes, carts, well markers, and his hands, though marked by the journey, still knew how to shape. The language was a barrier, but the craft spoke for him. He worked from sunrise to sunset and at night came back to watch the child grow. He didn't say much, but said everything with his eyes. Mary tended the home. She baked flatbread, heated water, cradled the child to the sound of whispered psalms. Her hair was now more tightly bound, her shoulders heavier, but her gaze remained steady. She and Joseph shared everything: coins, silence, fear, faith. Little by little, Joseph learned the village paths, met neighbors, gained trust. Children watched him with curiosity. They called him the man who doesn't talk much, the elder's son of David, a reverence no one dared to explain. He missed Nazareth, the trees, the sounds, the measures of the old home. But he knew they were needed there. It wasn't exile. It was mission. God had not abandoned them. He had simply moved them. One night, the child awoke with a fever. Joseph jumped up, prepared an herbal infusion, dampened cloths, prayed silently. Mary cradled the child, his forehead damp, lips dry. The night stretched like a bottomless well. But by dawn the heat subsided, and the child slept peacefully in his earthly father's arms. It was in that moment Joseph realized protecting was not just about fleeing the sword. It was also about watching through the heat, caring in silence, loving in the details. The fatherhood God had entrusted to him had no glory, but it bore eternal weight. The months passed. Egypt remained strange, but it was no longer hostile. Joseph walked with more confidence, bought supplies with more ease, spoke few words, but firmly the workshop grew. His reputation solidified, and still no one knew who the boy was. No one suspected the truth, and that was for the best. Joseph knew his role wasn't to reveal, it was to protect. On the Sabbath, they gathered with other Jews. They read the scrolls of the law, sang psalms, shared memories. Joseph listened more than he spoke, but his eyes shone. When the child, even so young, fixed his gaze on the sacred scroll as if already recognizing the word, he saw and kept it in his heart. One afternoon, while adjusting a cartwheel, he heard Mary call him with a tone he already knew, something between surprise and reverence. When he entered, he saw the child standing leaning on a beam. One step, then another, the first walk, the first gesture of the son who one day would walk to the cross. Joseph didn't applaud, didn't shout. He simply knelt. And there, before the most ordinary act, felt the weight of the eternal. In that exile, Joseph became a father in full, not with words but with presence, not with miracles but with faithfulness, because being the Savior's father was above all being the faithful shadow of the eternal Father. Matthew 2:19-23. Time in Egypt had no seasons, not like in Nazareth. The sky there was always dry, the ground always hot, the faces always unfamiliar. Joseph no longer counted days, he counted signs. And the sign came on a calm night. He dreamed, and in the dream the same voice as before returned. Get up, take the child and his mother and go back to the land of Israel. Those who sought the child's life are dead. Joseph opened his eyes slowly, but his heart was already in motion. Mary's steady breathing beside him, the child sleeping in peace. Everything seemed to rest on a thread. He rose without a sound, went to the clay house's entrance and looked eastward. Far away the hills of Judea were calling. It was time to return. The next day they gathered their few belongings. The donkey was no longer the same. Old, tired, but still obedient. The tools, the cloths, the small box of coins, everything fit into 2 bags. The child, now walking confidently, walked between Joseph and Mary with eyes alert to the world. It was strange to think they were returning to the promised land, but not to the promise itself. They returned for survival. The mission was still silent, the sun still hidden. The journey was long, exhausting. The path back carried the weight of memories, the flight, the innocent blood, the exile. Every step was a memory. Joseph looked ahead but saw behind. When they reached the border of Judea, the sun was already setting. A traveler approached and offered dry bread in exchange for water. They sat together and shared stories. Herod is dead, said the man. But his son, Archelaus, now rules in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. They say he inherited the cruelty, but not the cunning. Joseph listened in silence. He didn't respond, but his heart tightened. Bethlehem? Not yet. That same night the angel returned. As before, as always, do not return to Judea. Go to Galilee. Joseph woke in peace. The direction was clear. Nazareth awaited them. The town that had seen them leave under judgment would now be a refuge. It felt strange. The plan seemed circular, returning to the place of scorn, of humiliation, of silence. But there was no mistake in it. There was purpose. God once again used the despised as a hiding place. Their entrance into Nazareth was quiet. No announcement, no trumpet, just 3 travelers, dusty from the road, crossing the gate with lowered eyes and steady steps. Some faces were still familiar and others pretended not to see. Joseph found shelter with distant relatives. A narrow room, stone walls, thatched roof, not much different from what they had left. But now something was different in them. On the first morning, Joseph rose early, took his tools, and looked for work. Some hesitated, others accepted out of compassion, but Wood did not question. It simply yielded to the firm hand, and soon the improvised workshop breathed again. Mary reorganized the home, the cloths, the provisions, the water jars. The boy was growing. His eyes sparkled with questions. His hands already touched everything with lively curiosity. At every new sound, he wanted an answer. At every gesture, he imitated his father. Joseph watched him carefully, like someone guarding a secret that could not yet be revealed, like someone who loves knowing he will one day have to let go. Nazareth slowly accepted them back, not with celebration, not with honor, but with the kind of tolerance that time teaches. Some still whispered, but now it was different. The boy was handsome, intelligent, obedient, and Joseph remained righteous. The return that never happened to Bethlehem became a permanence in Nazareth and in time, a mission, because Joseph understood it wasn't where he wanted to be. It was where he needed to be. God's plan did not always follow human logic, and he had already learned to trust the voice of heaven more than the desires of the heart. In the synagogue, he sat in the same corner, quiet, but his eyes always turned to the boy. He taught him to measure, to cut, to sand, but also to listen, to pause, to show respect. The work was hard, but there was peace in labor because each day lived with faithfulness was another brick in the invisible temple being built there. No one spoke of Egypt anymore. No one asked about the birth. The town moved on. The world was unaware. But Joseph knew there, hidden among stone walls and dust, the Savior was growing, and he guarded him with his hands. Your participation is essential. Subscribe, leave a like, and share with someone who values meaningful stories. That way this message reaches even further. Let's continue the story. The sound of the hammer was the same every day. Wood against wood, stone against blade. Joseph's workshop had become part of the village's melody. Nothing flashy, nothing grand, but constant like him. Nazareth no longer saw him as a stranger. He was simply the carpenter, the one who speaks little, works much and always pays, the one who returns home at the same hour, tunic soaked in sweat and a calm face. But few knew that in that space of dust and shavings, something eternal was growing. Jesus had started to join his Father. He had small hands, but curious ones, eyes fixed on every gesture. He didn't ask much, but absorbed everything. Joseph would call him in the morning with a nod, and the boy would come tying the sash of his tunic with still clumsy but determined fingers. Bring the ruler, get the rope, hold tight. And he would hold tight. Sometimes he got it wrong, sometimes he got hurt, but he never gave up. Joseph saw in him not just an apprentice, but a reflection of what he himself had been, a boy in silence, seeking direction. The Talmud said, "A father must teach his son to read, to swim, and to work." Joseph didn't know how to swim, but he taught with his hands, with wood, with sweat. He showed him how to respect every line of the plank, how to listen to the sound of the chisel against stone, how to measure twice before cutting. It was more than technique, it was temperament. Jesus was learning the weight of objects, the wait before harvest, the repetition of gestures that shape character. The two didn't talk much while working, but there was communication in every tool passed, in every shared silence, in every rhythm of breath between effort and relief. Mary from the doorway watched them, the Father and the Son. One man hiding heaven in his hands, the other learning to use them. At midday they stopped, sat beneath the fig tree beside the house, shared bread and water. Joseph ate slowly. Jesus did too. Sometimes the boy asked questions that went beyond wood. "Abba, why does the sun rise from the same side every day?" Joseph didn't answer with scholarly words, but said, "Because God likes order." And the boy smiled as if that were enough. Other times Jesus observed the animals, the shape of the clouds, the walk of the neighbors. Joseph could see something beyond in his eyes, something beyond childhood, but he didn't ask. Not because he feared the answer, but because he knew some answers grow on their own, like seeds. One afternoon, while teaching him to sand a piece of acacia, Joseph looked at the boy's hands. There were already small calluses, marks of effort, and for a moment he remembered what the angel had said years before. He will save his people from their sins. Joseph didn't know how nor when, but he knew that every gesture, no matter how small, was part of something greater. Teaching Jesus to cut wood was more than passing on a trade. It was preparing him to build and perhaps to be broken. On the Sabbath, they walked together to the synagogue. Joseph held the boy's hand. They sat among the men, and the scroll of the law was read. The boy listened attentively, recited the blessings with a voice still soft but firm. Afterward, they returned in silent, the beaten path, the sound of sandals, the gentle afternoon breeze. Joseph looked at him and thought, I teach him, but what does he know that I don't? Time passed with the slowness of those who live with purpose. The days repeated but were never the same. Each board cut, each bench completed, each meal shared, all shaped what was to come. At night, Mary lit the lamp. Joseph made small corrections to projects. Jesus, already lying down, asked, You told me about David, but he was a king. Why aren't you? Joseph smiled with a quiet sigh. Because what matters isn't the throne, it's faithfulness. And he turned away, closing another day. Such were the years in Nazareth, invisible to the world, uncounted by historians, but essential to heaven. Joseph unknowingly was teaching the Savior of the world how to be a man, and that was enough. Luke 2:41-50. Jerusalem was bigger than Jesus remembered. It had towering walls, white stones that burned under the sun, narrow streets teeming with pilgrims, merchants, and priests. The city was a living organism, and Joseph observed it with cautious eyes. Mary walked close by, watching her son's steps. It was the Passover festival, and they, as every year, went up to the holy city to celebrate. Jesus had turned 12, no longer a child, but not yet a man. He walked between both worlds. There was something new in him, an attentiveness that listened more than it saw. In the temple corridors, his eyes scanned every inscription with reverence. The offerings, the songs, the debates among teachers, all touched him as if already familiar. Joseph watched from a distance. He did not interfere, but he kept it all in his heart. The festival lasted the prescribed days. The city celebrated with fervor. When it ended, the crowd began descending back to the villages. Joseph and Mary, trusting in the company of relatives and neighbors, walked with the group. The custom was for children to walk together in the caravan. But something felt different on that return. At the end of the first day's journey, the group set up camp. Night fell over the Judean hills. Mary went to look for Jesus among the cousins. She couldn't find him, asked friends. No one had seen him. She called Joseph with a tone of urgency he hadn't heard in years. He's not here. Immediately, Joseph stood up. His legs, stiff from the walk, began to move again. Fast, direct. One by one, he checked the travelers, the paths, the passing shepherds. Nothing. The boy had vanished. The despair was quiet. Joseph didn't shout, but the tension in his face, the rhythm of his breathing, the firmness with which he packed their things, everything about him spoke of urgency. They returned to Jerusalem along the same road. 3 days. 3 days of searching. 3 days of anguish. 3 days not knowing. Each morning they entered synagogues, asked vendors, guards, women in the market, described a boy with steady eyes, unusual words, a focused gaze. Some vaguely remembered, others shook their heads. Nothing certain. Joseph didn't sleep, barely ate. The fatigue weighed on his back, but he didn't stop. He walked without a map, only with the memory of his son's face and the guilt pressing on his chest. On the third day they entered the temple, and there he was, seated among the teachers, not standing like a student, but among them as an equal. He discussed, asked questions, answered. The elders were amazed, not by arrogance, but by genuine astonishment. The wisdom coming from that still adolescent mouth was pure, clear, direct, and Joseph froze. For a moment he didn't know whether to run to him or just watch. It was Mary who spoke first. Son, why have you done this to us? Look, your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. Jesus turned. His eyes still seemed immersed in the scriptures, but upon seeing them, a slight smile appeared and he replied, Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I must be about my father's business? Joseph heard, but didn't understand. My father. Those words pierced his heart with sweetness and pain. It was true. He knew from the beginning, from the dream, from the cave, the boy was not his, or at least not only his. And still, Joseph was a father. Jesus' answer wasn't disobedience, it was revelation. He hadn't gotten lost, he had revealed himself. But Joseph still couldn't comprehend. His role wasn't to explain, it was to keep. Jesus stood up, came to them, and walked with them back home. Along the way, little was said. The city faded behind them, the voices dissipated. Joseph looked at the boy walking ahead of him, and all that made sense was the next step. When they arrived in Nazareth, life went on. Jesus returned to the workshop, to the wood, to the routine. But something had changed. Joseph knew, and he didn't need to understand everything. It was enough to obey. In Nazareth, time was not measured by years, but by harvests, by house repairs, by worn stools, used-up tools, inherited cloaks. Joseph aged slowly, and Jesus grew at a pace that seemed measured by something the world couldn't grasp. The boy's voice deepened. His hands broadened. His eyes, once curious, became profound, as if they saw far beyond what was in front of them. And still he remained there in the workshop, helping, listening, carrying wood. Joseph saw it all and at the same time did not understand. It was no longer about teaching. Now it was about observing and accepting. Some days Joseph saw him talking with passing pilgrims. Other times he found him gazing at the sky for long moments as if waiting for time to say something. At night Jesus studied the scrolls. He hungered for the word, as if it called him by name. Joseph remembered the temple, the answer he had heard years before. Didn't you know I must be about my father's business? He never forgot those words. Joseph was never offended, but he also never understood. Galilee was a rough place. Rome's presence was constant. There were soldiers on the roads, heavy taxes, veiled threats. Religion at times was more burden than relief. There were Pharisees policing, Sadducees bargaining, and zealots conspiring. Joseph stayed away from all of it. But Jesus observed everything. Some days Joseph noticed a sadness in Jesus that he couldn't name. A restlessness, a restrained impulse, as if something within him were waiting for a calling. That's when Joseph felt the weight of his own limitations. He was a father. But there were limits even love could not cross. He couldn't protect him from what was inside him. He couldn't shape him as he shaped the wood. He couldn't guide him where there was no path. Flavius Josephus, writing about the people of Galilee, spoke of hardened men, laborers, faithful to tradition, yet unable to see beyond what their eyes touched. Joseph was that man. Just, steady, constant, but human. And his son was not. Joseph continued his craft. He made tables, gates, wheels. Customers respected him, called him trustworthy, quiet, honest. Mary tended the house. Jesus' sisters helped where they could. His younger brothers ran through the fields, but a sense of farewell slowly grew like the breeze that shifts before the storm. One morning, while sharpening a blade, Joseph looked at Jesus and had the impression that he was already far away. Not physically, but in spirit, like someone already walking through a path no one else could see. He felt small. Not from shame, but from reverence. It was like standing before a roofless temple and realizing that despite working on the columns, he would never see the completed altar. That night, Joseph woke with a strange feeling in his chest. It wasn't pain nor a dream. It was like a voiceless whisper saying, "Your time is ending." He said nothing to anyone. But that day he worked more slowly. He called Jesus to cut wood with him, touched his son's shoulder with more firmness, and when the day's work was done, he looked long at the sunset. He had done what he could. He had obeyed. He had protected. Now the rest was between the son and the father. It was a meal like any other. Bread baked on stone, fresh oil, figs cut with care, cool water in a clay jar. The table was low. The wooden benches still creaked when someone sat down. Mary placed the dishes with her usual gestures. Jesus helped serve the portions among his siblings. But Joseph felt something different that night. The smell of the food was the same, the words the same, but there was a silence that came from within, not from the room but from time itself. A silence of farewell. He said nothing. Sat as always, rested his hands on his knees, watched. Mary chatted with the younger ones. Jesus, now nearly 30, ate slowly. His eyes were no longer those of a youth, they were those of a grown man, and Joseph knew that man was the same boy he had once held in his arms decades ago in a cave in Bethlehem. And now it was time to let him go. There was no illness, no warning, just a foreboding, a kind of emptiness that wasn't physical. It was spiritual, like a lamp that begins to dim slowly without a spark. He felt no pain, but he felt the end, the Arabic gospel of the infancy, which many had already dismissed as implausible, described Joseph's final days with simplicity. Origen, when mentioning it, did not treat it as legend, but as the living memory of a generation that still preserved details, lost in the folds of time. And among those details, there was a meal, a last table, an ordinary evening marked by hidden eternity. Joseph broke the bread, handed it to Jesus. There were no sacred words, but the gesture was full of meaning. It was as if he was saying, "Now you are the one who breaks. I only served until now." Jesus looked at him calmly as if he knew, as if he too felt that after that supper everything would change. They looked at each other for a long time. There were no tears, but there was surrender. Mary noticed, intuited. She said nothing, but sat beside Joseph with her plate still full. Her fingers touched his arm, an old gesture of a wife, of a friend, of a companion. After the meal, the younger ones dispersed. The lamp's flame flickered. The house breathed as if trying to preserve the peace of the moment. Joseph did not rise. He remained there, seated, eyes on the fire. He felt light, as if no longer bound to the ground. Jesus sat beside him. "Is everything ready, Arba?" he asked softly. Joseph nodded. Though he didn't understand everything, he felt everything. His time was complete. His craft ended there. The boards, the tools, the teachings, all were now in his hands. He was not a priest, not a prophet, but his life had been altar and sacrifice. His silence was a word, his gaze a promise, his labor obedience. "Take care of your mother," he murmured, voice raspy. Jesus took his hand, strong, warm, always. Mary came closer, wrapped Joseph in a thicker cloak. The night was cold, but he no longer felt it, no longer needed it. At that final supper there was no miracle, but there was glory. The glory of a man who lived without fame, died without record, and still upheld with faithfulness the Savior of the world, the Son. That morning seemed gentler. The light entered through the window more slowly. The house was silent even with the village sounds around. Inside, time had slowed, as if waiting for something. Joseph was lying down, not from sudden weakness, nor from a violent illness, simply because the body, after so many years of service, finally asked for rest. His hands, once firm over tools, now rested on his chest. His face, marked by time, held the serenity of one who never needed to be heard to be obeyed. Mary was beside him, sitting, one hand on his, the other on her lap. Her tearful eyes did not blink, and next to her Jesus, already a man, standing but bent with love. The two, the woman and the son, were all Joseph needed to see before leaving. He said nothing. It was no longer necessary. From the earliest writings of the Church Fathers, there was a reverent consensus. Joseph died in peace surrounded by Mary and Jesus. There is no canonical record, no specific verse, but the oldest tradition upheld by authors like Jerome and Epiphanius said his departure was marked by a single greatness, the silent presence of heaven at his side. Joseph knew the end was near, and he did not complain. He was not a man of lament. He was a man of acceptance. In his final days, he stopped going to the workshop. He would sit outside in the afternoon sun, watching the fields, listening to the birds, calling Jesus with his eyes, and together they shared small phrases like scraps of a life that no longer needed explanation. "Remember when we made that table for Simeon's family?" he asked once. Jesus smiled. "It's still standing." Joseph laughed lightly, like someone who knows that everything made with love lasts beyond time. Now on that simple bed surrounded by stone walls and memories, Joseph felt no fear, no regret. He felt fullness. Mary held his hand tightly. The silence between them was prayer. There were tears, yes, but not of despair. They were waters that cleansed the soul before the flight. Jesus stood looking into his eyes. No words were spoken, no sermon, just presence. Joseph's hand trembled slightly. His fingers reached for Mary's face. He touched her as if in gratitude. Then he looked at Jesus, and there in that gaze was everything a father wants to say to a son. I trust you. I rejoice in you. Go. Jesus took that aged hand in both of his, held it gently, closed his eyes. Joseph's breathing slowed, first a more spaced rhythm, then lighter until the chest stopped, and everything became silence, but not emptiness. It was a full silence, the same that had accompanied him from the beginning. The silence of the just, of those who obey without applause, who believe without signs, who love without needing to be remembered. Joseph departed as he lived, without spectacle, without ceremony, only faith. Mary wept. Jesus remained silent. But there, in that hidden room in Nazareth, all of heaven bowed because the man who once held the Savior of the world in his arms was now being held by him in eternity. Luke 3:23. The house was the same. The wooden table still stood firm at the center. The worn bench leaned against the wall. The utensils in their usual places. The scent of firewood still clung to the cloaks, but Joseph was no longer there. Mary rose early, lit the flame, prepared the bread, listened to the silence. Not the silence of dawn, but the silence of absence. A silence that didn't weigh in the air, but in the chest. He would not return. And yet, he seemed to be in everything. Jesus was now a man. At 30, his steps no longer asked permission to cross thresholds. But Mary saw in the way he arranged the workshop tools, in the way he gathered wood scraps, the traits of his earthly father. Joseph remained alive in the son's gestures. Luke would write, being as was thought, the son of Joseph as was thought. As if he were, as if Mary read those words without reading them, she knew. Joseph knew. God knew. But the world needed labels. And so Joseph, even absent, remained in the name, in the memory, in the genealogy. It was strange to see him disappear like that, not just from life, but from the records. No mention in the sermons. No disciple would call him. No miracle would bear his name. But those who had known his home knew Joseph was the first altar where Jesus learned the silence of obedience. The workshop tools were still in place. Jesus cleaned them from time to time, touched each one as if still hearing silent advice. The weight of the hammer, the alignment of the ruler, the scent of cut wood. All was memory. Joseph had passed quietly, and now the world would go on without him, but not Mary. Sometimes she found his cloak folded in the corner. She would touch it, hold it. At night she still lay on one side of the bed, as if her body expected the other space not to be empty. She didn't always cry, but she kept and keeping hurt more. Jesus in turn began to go out more. Galilee was calling him, the fields, the men, the invisible ones. It was as if a force were pulling him outward, and Mary knew it was time. Still, the house was his point of origin, and Joseph, his point of reference. When a neighbor greeted him, they'd say, "There goes Joseph's son." Jesus smiled. Jesus, he didn't correct them. He didn't need to. Truth requires no defense, only testimony. And Joseph had been just that, a silent testimony of what it means to trust the unseen. On cold nights, Mary would sometimes light the fire and wait. Jesus would sit beside her. They shared dates or pieces of fig. He spoke little, she even less. But there was peace in the unspoken. He would be proud, Jesus said once. Mary nodded, eyes misty. She didn't need to ask who he meant. The name no longer spoken was the name that lived most in that place. Joseph, the just, the hidden, the man who said yes to the impossible and never asked for a stage, who gave up everything to protect what he could never fully understand and who, for that, was great. Time passed. Grief's marks became part of the soul's architecture. Mary cleaned the house but did not erase the traces. Every crack in the wall told a story. Every piece of furniture still bore his hand. Jesus knew that soon he would leave for good. The Jordan was just ahead. The desert awaited. But before departing, he rose once more before sunrise, went to the workshop, lit a lamp, sat on the bench where Joseph used to sit, and stayed there in silence as he did. Jesus now walked among crowds. He healed with his hands, taught with authority, and cast out fear with words that ignited the spirit. The blind could see, the deaf could hear, the dead rose. And people asked one another, "Where does he get such wisdom? How does he possess such power?" Some said, "He is a prophet." Others, "He is the Messiah." But there was always a voice that said, "Isn't he the carpenter's son?" The carpenter's son. Joseph's name came up like this as a forgotten comma in a sentence about someone greater. There was no honor, no remembrance. No disciple mentioned him in their sermons. No Pharisee accused him of anything. No parable included him. Joseph had disappeared. Flavius Josephus would write that the righteous men of Galilee were for the most part anonymous, invisible workers, silent citizens, people who built but did not sign, who obeyed but did not preach. And Joseph was exactly that. The foundation no one saw. But every temple needs a foundation. And the Son, now proclaimed from the mountains, was first sustained by a man who knew how to be a shadow, who said yes to the unknown, who gave up his own understanding to embrace the unexplainable. While Jesus walked through Capernaum, while he multiplied loaves, while he was followed by fishermen and sinners, Joseph's name remained buried in the dust of Nazareth. No plaques, no altars, no songs in the synagogues, but Mary remembered. She remained silent when she heard the people say, "Son of Joseph." She didn't correct them. She didn't need to because she knew that even absent, he was still there. In the way Jesus listened before speaking, in the firmness with which his hands held the sick, in the care with which he built the kingdom with words, Joseph had no pulpit, but he was the first to prepare the ground for the word. At a time when names multiplied, Herod, Caiaphas, Pilate, Gamaliel, Joseph's name became increasingly rare. Glory did not pass through him. History did not crown him, but heaven knows him. Jesus never forgot him. When teaching about seeds, he spoke with the calm of someone who had seen hands bury promises without applause. When speaking of faithful servants, his eyes always carried the memory of a man who preferred to obey than to be seen. The righteous, like Joseph, do not appear in the books of kings nor at the banquets of empires. They die before fame. They leave before the spectacle. But their traces remain in the structures. Their gestures shape the foundations. Joseph's absence in the records was not a mistake. It was a message. God wanted him to remain hidden to show that the invisible sustains the visible, that the Son's glory rests on the faithfulness of the earthly Father, that the kingdom begins in silence, in workshops, in nights of flight. When preaching in synagogues, Jesus mentioned Moses, Elijah, David, but his heart remembered the carpenter. Joseph didn't need to be remembered to have value. His mark was on the Messiah, and that was enough. Matthew 13:55. Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Isn't this the carpenter's son? The question, spoken with disdain, cut through the murmuring crowd like a spear disguised as irony. It wasn't just a doubt. It was a reminder of origin. A reminder that the man teaching with authority was after all from Nazareth, from that common home, from that house of wood and clay where everyone knew everyone. Aren't his brothers among us? James, Joseph, Simon, Judas, common names, sons of the same home, raised under the same roof, among the smell of cut wood and the steam of bread in the oven. Some of them believed, others did not. And the people knew it. The people used it. Joseph raised them all. It didn't matter whether they were his by blood or by covenant. The wood that shaped tables also shaped bonds. And Joseph was a master of that. He didn't teach with speeches, but with repetition, with routine, with faithfulness. Each of those sons learned to cut with precision, to measure carefully, to carry weight without complaint. Joseph made sure to teach that work was not just obligation, it was virtue. And even when Jesus' name echoed beyond borders, when crowds followed him, his brothers still carried the scent of the workshop. There was contrast within the very household. James was serious, observant. He had questions he didn't speak, but kept. Joseph noticed Simon was impulsive, wanted to prove his strength, tested the limits. Joseph would call him with a look, and that was enough. Judas was sensitive. Joseph taught him with more time, more patience. Joseph, the son who bore his name, was the quietest. And then there was Jesus, the most different of them all. As they grew, comparisons were inevitable. Jesus is the most obedient, some would say. He's the strangest, others would say. But Joseph never treated any of them differently. The standard was the same, the tone the same. The hand that corrected also comforted. The wood they came from was from a single tree: faith. When the brothers heard of Jesus' signs, they reacted in different ways. Some doubted. Who does he think he is? Others stayed silent. He was always like this. Some avoided him. Others got angry. None of them knew what to do with the greatness growing among common blood. But Joseph would have loved them just the same. Time had already taken him, but his teachings were embedded in the household habits. He was the one who gave out the first pieces of bread, who divided the chores, who taught that work begins before the sun rises and ends only when it is done well. The brothers' doubt wasn't heresy. It was human. They had seen Jesus stumble in the yard, had seen him skin his knee, miss a cut, cry over a sick animal. How could they now accept that he was the promised one? But what they didn't understand was that his humanity didn't deny his divinity. It was part of the plan. Joseph knew that. Even without understanding everything, he knew it wasn't his role to prove anything, just to shape. And he did with silence, with firmness, with hands that held and released at the right time. James later would understand. He would become a leader among the disciples. But for now he still wavered. Jesus, faced with the unbelief of his own, wasn't offended. He simply acknowledged even those raised under the same roof may not see what is before their eyes. And still he loved them all because he learned from Joseph. Before the next twist happens, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and send it to someone who needs to hear this. Your support expands the reach of this message. And now back to the story. John 5:19. The crowds followed Jesus everywhere. They wanted healing, answers, confrontation. The Pharisees wanted proof. The sick wanted a touch. The poor wanted bread. And he gave, but with compassion, with authority, with mystery. But there was something few noticed. In every gesture of his there was an ancient echo, the echo of a father. The son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his father doing. The words echoed through the temple courtyard, crossing walls and hearts. The listeners thought of the God of Abraham, the Lord of hosts, the Heavenly Father. But perhaps unknowingly, they were also hearing the reflection of a man who had shaped the boy from Nazareth, the earthly father. Joseph, absent from the ministry, forgotten in the narratives, erased from the miracles, but present in every gesture Jesus made. The way he listened before speaking, the way he paused before acting, the firmness in his gaze, the reverence for work well done. It all came from an earlier place, from the workshop, from the home, from the silence. When Jesus healed, he didn't rush the touch. When he spoke, he didn't shout. When he walked through the villages, his steps were calm, attentive to the ground. There was no hurry in his ministry because the time Joseph had taught him was not man's time. It was the time of growth, of care, of surrender without urgency. Joseph never said, "Follow me." But the son followed him for 30 years. Jesus remembered the wet wood, the smell of oil on his father's fingers, the way he steadied the plank with one hand and trimmed it with the other. He remembered the insistence on teaching that a wrong cut isn't fixed with haste, but with patience, that a structure can only stand if the foundation is deep. He had learned all this from his earthly father to then entrust himself to the heavenly Father. When Jesus spoke of seeds that die to bear fruit, he remembered how Joseph carefully planted seedlings. When he spoke of vines and branches, he remembered the vineyards on the hillside they had pruned together. When he spoke of the easy yoke, He remembered the yokes his father made, not to burden the ox, but to relieve it. Joseph didn't teach theology, but he taught presence. He didn't explain mysteries, but he respected them. He didn't perform miracles, but he upheld the greatest one with his own name. When Jesus prayed often in silence, he was like Joseph, who always chose silence before response. When he withdrew to be alone, he was like the father who preferred listening to being heard. And when he forgave, he was like Joseph had forgiven him as a child without condemnation, only with a gesture of acceptance. Joseph's absence was now complete. His hands were gone. His shadow no longer appeared at the door, but the Son carried within himself the carpenter's mark, the invisible mold of the righteous one. And that was enough, because even the Savior made flesh needed human hands to be shaped. Joseph, a simple name, a common name, a name repeated in many homes among many children, but also a chosen name, because every name, say the wise, carries a hidden destiny within, waiting for someone willing to bear it, and he accepted it. Joseph of the line of David was born without glory, lived without fame, and died without a written story. But that is precisely why heaven chose him. Not so his name would shine in the records of kings, but so it would shine where no one sees, in the backstage of the miracle. From the beginning, the name Joseph carried echoes of another patriarch, the son of Jacob, the one who was sold, humiliated, forgotten, and later exalted in Egypt, the one who sustained his family even after betrayal. And like the first Joseph, Mary's husband was also a man of dreams, of silence, of faithfulness. He had no throne, but he held the throne in his arms in the form of a child. He wore no crown, but he protected the one who would be crowned with thorns. In the tradition of the ancients, giving a name was sealing a path. And when Mary gave birth and Joseph named him as the angel had commanded, Jesus, he sealed more than a civil record. He sealed his own surrender, because in naming, he was claiming. In saying Jesus, he was saying mine. And the name Joseph, once forgotten among stones and tools, became the foundation of the word. His legacy wasn't left on scrolls. He didn't found schools. He left no speeches. But he left footprints in the clay of Nazareth. He left marks in Jesus' eyes. And for this, even if the world forgets him, his name remains in the heavens. Across generations, many sons would carry that name, not for glory, but out of a desire to learn from the righteous one who obeyed in silence. Joseph didn't need to understand all the mysteries. He only needed to trust. He didn't demand signs. He simply listened and responded. His name didn't change the world by force, but it shaped the one who would change everything. When the people asked, "Isn't this Jesus, the son of Joseph?" it was more than a question. It was a seal, a reminder that the Messiah had a father, that God, upon coming into the world, entrusted himself to the hands of a common man, and that this man did not fail. The name Joseph carried wood and dust, but also promises. He didn't know how great he was, and he didn't need to. Joseph's greatness was precisely in never seeking to be great, and for that, his name echoes, not in palaces but in humble homes, not on thrones but in hearts that prefer obedience to understanding, that prefer protecting over dominating, that prefer silence over proving. Joseph's legacy wasn't built with nails or doctrines, but with presence and with a name that in Hebrew means God adds. And indeed, he added honor to humility. He added meaning to service. He added glory to anonymity. And everyone who carries that name today also carries an invitation to live as he lived, to obey as he obeyed, to love as he loved in silence, but forever. Matthew 13:55. Isn't this the carpenter's son? The phrase was spoken with disdain, with disbelief, with the kind of scorn that hides fear. Isn't this the carpenter's son? As if carpenters couldn't raise prophets, as if hands that worked with wood couldn't shape the invisible. But heaven does not think like men. To human eyes, Joseph was just a man among planks, a craftsman among many. His hands bore calluses, not titles. His sun-weathered face wasn't seen in the circles of the wise. His name too common, his trade too simple. But to heaven, Joseph was more than a carpenter. He was the chosen guardian, the artisan who would shape not only furniture, but the Messiah. The workshop in Nazareth was small. It smelled of raw wood, oil, and dust, hammer, chisel, sandpaper. The tools were few but enough. Joseph taught Jesus to work and unknowingly prepared him for something greater. Each time he aligned the frame of a door, he taught firmness. Each time he fixed a crack, he taught restoration. Each time he paused to think before cutting, he taught discernment. He didn't preach sermons, but his tools did. The world saw wood, but heaven saw a framework. The world saw a hammer, but heaven heard a prayer. Joseph didn't know what was to come. He didn't know of crosses. He didn't know of tombs, but his trade was wrapped in prophecy. He taught the Son of God to work with nails, not knowing those very nails would one day pierce his hands. The irony was sacred, not to humiliate, but to show that God turns the ordinary into the eternal, that the floor of Joseph's workshop was also temple ground, that every bench he built carried an invisible prophecy. The Messiah would sit on something made by his human hands, taught by Joseph's hands. The carpenter's trade wasn't a shame. It was disguised honor. Joseph wasn't just a laborer. He was a transmitter. What he received from his parents, he passed on. What he learned in silence, he taught with a glance. His workshop was a school, an altar, a refuge. It was where the word became gesture. He wrote no books, but his hands left marks on Jesus. When Jesus healed with a touch, that touch already knew the weight of wood. When he sat at the table with sinners, that body already knew the balance of a well-built plank. When he spoke of the light burden and the easy yoke, he was speaking from experience learned there among sawdust and nails. Joseph was called the carpenter, but heaven called him my faithful servant. He didn't need miracles to be used by God. He only needed to obey, to work, to love, to care, to sustain, to wait, to persevere. In every hammer strike, a silent prayer. In every board, an invisible promise. In every nail, a surrender. The world forgot him, but the Son did not. Jesus carried Joseph's marks to the end, not the marks of genetics, but of life together. The firmness, the gentleness, the quiet justice. All of it was Joseph, God's carpenter. And when on the cross they mockingly called him King of the Jews, perhaps in a fleeting memory, Jesus thought of the one who once taught him to hold a hammer and who never sought honor, only presence. Luke 23. Absence of Joseph in the crucifixion account, symbolism of fatherly presence. The road to Golgotha was paved with stone and blood. Crowds followed, some wept, others shouted. Many just watched, confused. The soldiers hurried him along. The cross weighed on the Son's back. And though his steps faltered, they continued. But there was something that did not falter. The gaze. Jesus didn't look at the ground nor at the aggressors. His face was bruised, his shoulders torn open, but his eyes steady, as if searching for something beyond the pain, as if carrying not only a burden but also a memory. And those who had known him well knew that gaze was Joseph's. They were no longer together. Death had already separated the righteous man from the Son now dying for the unrighteous. But even absent, Joseph was there. Not in body, but in memory, in the lessons, in the gestures the Son kept within. When Jesus fell, the hands that tried to help him were not Joseph's, but the Father's memory helped him rise. Since childhood, every fall was followed by silence, a strong arm, and a calm voice. Get up, my son. You can do it. On the cross, that voice was no longer there, but the echoes remained. The Messiah climbed the hill, carrying the world and also the teachings of home. Joseph never witnessed miracles, never saw the crowds, never heard the sermons, but he saw the boy learn to walk, to carry tools, to forgive neighbors, to share food, to wake early to help. And perhaps he saw something more, a light in the Son's eyes he never understood, but always respected. Now that light endured even the shadow of death. The cross was planted. The nails pierced the flesh. Voices mocked. The sky darkened. But Jesus' eyes did not fade. They looked at Mary. They looked at John. They looked at the thief. And finally, they looked upward. But at some moment, Perhaps inwardly, Jesus also looked back to the house, to childhood, to the man who raised him without asking for anything in return. Joseph never had all the answers, but he was present. Never asked for glory, but gave a name. Never understood everything, but never stopped caring. And now on that cross, the Son did the same. Gave himself without asking for anything. Fulfilled his mission without seeking defense. Died as he lived with obedience. Joseph wasn't at Calvary. His voice wasn't heard. His name wasn't recorded. But in the Son, he was fully there. Because in every gesture of Jesus there were traces of the Carpenter. When he forgave his accusers, it was like Joseph who forgave in silence. When he cared for Mary, it was like Joseph who had protected her from the beginning. When he gave up his spirit, it was like Joseph who always gave everything without fanfare. The cross was new, but the wood ancient. Ancient like the workshop, like home, like a father's love. The sky darkened, the earth shook, the veil was torn. And Jesus' eyes closed, but even closed, they kept saying, "He taught me how to walk." Joseph departed long before the cross, but the cross was never without him, because the Son's eyes until the end reflected the righteous man who taught him to see. Luke 17. The silence of the righteous cries out louder than the prophets. Joseph said nothing. There is no record of a sentence, no speech, no parable, not even a greeting. He passed through the Gospels as one who walks without leaving footprints, but his lack of words was in itself a language. Joseph's silence was not omission. It was choice. It was surrender. It was reverence before the mystery entrusted to him. While others cried out for signs, Joseph listened to dreams. While others made vows, Joseph obeyed in silence. While others demanded answers, Joseph simply walked. He did not need to justify himself when Mary appeared pregnant. He did not argue with the angel. He did not protest the census. He did not question the flight to Egypt. He acted, and by acting, he taught. Origen centuries later would say that the silence of the righteous speaks louder than the prophets. And there was no man more righteous and more silent than Joseph. His theology was not in scrolls. It was in the everyday and how he looked at Mary and how he protected the son and how he sustained the home. His hands preached, his eyes interceded, his breath prayed, and his silence echoed. In rabbinic tradition, it is said that wise men speak little, and the truly righteous speak even less because silence when sacred is not emptiness. It is fullness that cannot be contained in words. Joseph lived this way. When the angel visited him in a dream, he told no one. When he left with Mary for Bethlehem, he did not complain. When he found no place at the inn, he improvised. When he fled to Egypt, he carried the promise in his arms and no complaint on his lips. There was no time for speeches, only for faithfulness. It's curious. So many men left words. Moses, laws, David, Psalms, Isaiah, visions, Peter, letters, Paul, treatises. But Joseph, nothing. And yet he is among the greatest. Because while others spoke about God, Joseph held God in his arms, fed him, protected him, taught him to walk, to hammer, to listen, and he did it in silence. Perhaps that is exactly why his figure unsettled so many, because we live in a world that shouts, that explains itself, that promotes itself. And Joseph simply was. He was righteous. He was a father. He was a servant, nothing more, and therefore everything. His lack of words is not weakness, it is strength, because true love does not need justification. True faith does not demand applause. True obedience makes no noise. Joseph lived hidden, died without ceremony, was buried without honors, but in heaven his name is known not because he spoke but because he lived. Today many seek to leave memorable quotes, sayings, texts, posts, but Joseph's legacy is different. It is the hidden life that sustained the visible. He is the man no one heard yet everyone feels. The Son did not quote him in the Gospels but carried him in his heart, and perhaps that is what matters most. Joseph didn't need to say anything because his silence still speaks. Matthew 1:16. The Messianic genealogy ending with Joseph. The story ends as it began in silence. There are no statues, no inscriptions, no direct quotes in apostolic speeches, no glorious appearances. Joseph disappears from the narrative as discreetly as he entered. Like a shadow that protects without being seen, but what is invisible to the eyes of men remains etched in heaven. Matthew begins his gospel with a lineage, ancient names, kings and shepherds, flawed men and prophets. From Abraham to David, from David to the exile, from the exile to Joseph, not Mary, not Jesus, but Joseph, the final human name in the genealogy, the last link in a chain that spanned centuries, wars, deserts, betrayals, and promises. Joseph did not biologically father the Messiah, but he received him, adopted him, gave him a name, a home, an inheritance, and that was enough because God does not measure blood. He measures the heart. In Jewish tradition, the father is the one who passes on the name, and the name carries destiny. Joseph, by naming Jesus, sealed prophecies, grafted the Son of God into the royal lineage, fulfilled Scripture with the resolve of a man who, even without understanding everything, trusted the unseen. And so it ends unseen but eternal. The world remembers Peter for the keys, Paul for the letters, Moses for the tablets, David for the harp, but Joseph for his absence. Absence of self, absence of vanity, absence of ambition, full presence deep within the story. When Jesus spoke of the Father, he spoke of the eternal Father. But when he loved tenderly, he carried the gesture learned at home. When he walked among carpenters, he knew the rhythm of the work. When he remained silent before his accusers, there was in him the echo of the man who taught him the value of silence. Joseph's memory lives where few look. In Jesus' eyes, in Mary's resolve, in the structure of the home, in the warmth of a workshop, in the forgotten genealogy. Matthew was not wrong to end it with Joseph. It was there that everything came together, because at the end of the lineage, heaven draws near to earth. In the simplicity of the righteous, the kingdom finds rest. In the surrender of the common man, eternity finds support. Joseph did not build temples, but he sustained the Savior of the world. He did not write laws, but he lived justice. He did not ascend to a throne, but he raised his home as an altar. In the stories of the great, he would be a footnote, but in heaven he is a cornerstone. The genealogy ends with him, but the legacy continues. In every righteous one who loves without recognition, in every father who cares without applause, in every believer who obeys without explanations. Joseph lives in silence as always. But now the world sees him, because what is invisible to the eyes of God is unforgettable. The next stories are already waiting for you on the screen. Click now and keep discovering the mysteries and forgotten treasures of the Scriptures. Each chapter holds a truth that time tried to erase. Thank you for walking with us this far. May this journey stay alive in you. We'll meet again in the next revelation. See you soon.